36 years ago, amid a night when the first snow of the season blanketed Minnesota white, a young man disappeared on his way home, leaving behind only his car with no trace and the despair of his parents. The case quickly sank into silence, concluded as an accident in a snowstorm, but many believe that something was buried under the cold ice of Gull Lake. Over the decades, winters passed, carrying whispers of secrets, a truth hidden by the very person once called the town's hero. Then modern DNA technology awakened the past, pulling the small peaceful community into a shock no one anticipated. Before we dive into exploring this chilling cold case and the journey to uncover the secret buried for 36 years, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss other haunting cold case stories. Early morning in Brainerd, Minnesota, the air froze stiff like a frosted glass pane, thick patches of snow-tinted blue under the flashing police lights reflecting on the frozen surface of Gull Lake. The loudspeaker shattered the quiet of the lakeside neighborhood. Crow Wing County Sheriff's Office. "Mr. Keller, please open the door." The wooden door of the small house at 74 Gull River Drive swung open, cold air spilling out along with the steam from a cup of coffee that hadn't cooled yet. A silver-haired man, sturdy despite his advanced age, appeared in the doorway. He wore a thick ash-gray coat, still stained with a few machine oil smudges, remnants of his years working at the town's auto repair shop. "What's going on?" His voice was hoarse. Three officers advanced, the arrest warrant read aloud amid the snow. "Richard Keller, you are under arrest for involvement in the 1988 disappearance of citizen Evan Myers." Every movement froze for a few seconds. Keller looked around, his eyes sliding over familiar faces, one a former comrade, another who had once worked under him. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I was the one who searched for him." The young officer signaled, and the other two policemen stepped forward, cuffing his hands. The metallic click echoed softly, but chillingly cold. In the distance, neighbors began pulling back curtains, a few stepping out onto porches in robes, whispering. They couldn't believe it. Richard Keller, former police sergeant, who had been awarded a medal for dedication to the community, now being led away in the red and blue glow of patrol cars. The police car pulled away from the neighborhood, tires crunching on the thin snow layer, leaving two jagged black tracks heading toward downtown Brainerd. A young Care 11 reporter held up her microphone, her voice carrying through the lens. "After 36 years, Minnesota police have arrested a suspect in the mysterious disappearance that has haunted this community for decades." Behind her, the line of police lights reflected on the ice of Gull Lake, like hundreds of eyes opening. In the car, Keller sat silently, his cuffed hands resting on his lap. His breath was visible in the frigid air. The rearview mirror reflected his wrinkled face, bloodshot eyes hiding an indescribable weariness. Outside the window, the gray sky dropped new snowflakes. At the right corner of the car's radio, the announcer's voice droned on, steady and distant. 36 years ago, Evan Myers, 22, vanished on the first snowy night near Gull Lake. The case is considered the longest unsolved mystery in central Minnesota. The driving officer glanced in the mirror, then said softly, almost to himself, "Hard to believe. The whole town used to see him as a hero." Keller didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, where snow-covered trees receded behind. Patches of light reflecting on the ice flashed by, like old memories being dragged into the light, after more than 3 decades buried under Minnesota's silent ice. On the evening of November 18, 1988, Brainerd lay still in the season's first snowstorm. Wind from the north swept over the snow-blanketed rooftops, carrying a biting whistle that seeped through every crack in the doors. At the edge of the woods near County Road 77, the dim lights from Gull Lake Station gas station pierced through the thick fog. Inside, the young man in the dark denim jacket bent down to pull a bill from his wallet. "Fill it up," he said, his voice mingling with the wind. The station attendant, Mr. Nelson, nodded. "Tough weather to be driving far, heading to St. Cloud?" Evan smiled, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "No, back to Brainerd. My mom would worry if I got home late." That was the last time anyone saw him alive. Around 10:07 p.m., Marla Myers stood by the window, watching snow swirl in the yard. She picked up the phone, hearing her son's voice crackle through the weak signal. "I'm on my way home, Mom. Don't worry. The roads are a bit slippery, but it's fine." Then the line went dead. She held the receiver for a long moment, unease creeping into her chest. By midnight, the familiar rumble of the pickup truck still hadn't sounded outside. "Frank," Her husband turned on the porch light, peering out at the endless white road. He said softly, he might have stopped somewhere to wait out the storm. But his voice couldn't hide the worry. The next morning, snow had fallen so thick that vehicles could barely move. Frank drove his Ford Bronco along County Road 77, eyes scanning both sides of the woods. No trace, no fresh tire tracks, no metal scraps or glints of reflection from Evan's truck. When he returned, he found Marla trembling in the kitchen, clutching the copper bracelet, engraved with E that Evan always wore to work. "I can't take it anymore," she said. "We have to call the police." At 9 a.m., they were at the Crow Wing County Sheriff's Office. The duty room was quiet, the air thick with the smell of coffee and damp paper. A tall officer, slightly stooped with age, stepped out, Sergeant Richard Keller. He listened, jotting down every detail carefully, from the driving route and call time to the description of the 1984 gray Chevrolet Silverado, license plate 7DX271. "He would never just leave home," Frank said, his voice hardening. "My son works hard, there's no reason for him to run off." Keller nodded, his face stern under the fluorescent lights. "In Minnesota, people don't disappear in winter unless something's gone wrong. I'll have men check the entire route along Gull Lake." He called patrol units, directing a search perimeter around the western edge of Gull Lake, where County Road 77 curved north. Outside, snow still fell, wind whistling past the office roof in a persistent howl. As Keller stepped out, Marla gripped her husband's hand tightly. "Frank, do you think they'll find him?" The man watched Sergeant Keller's figure fade into the swirling snow, his eyes holding a faint spark of hope. "At least," he said slowly, "finally someone's going out to look." By noon, the first patrol cars set off along the snowy stretch. Red lights flashed, reflecting on the thick ice cover. On the local radio, a brief news bulletin cut into the weather forecast. A 22-year-old man reported missing in the Gull Lake area. Police urged residents to provide any information. In the Myers family's small home, the landline sat silent, only the ticking clock mingling with the heavy breaths of two people stepping into the longest days of their lives. That afternoon, as the snow began to ease, Sergeant Richard Keller arrived at Gull Lake Station gas station, the last place Evan Myers had been seen. He stepped out of the patrol car, boots sinking into the slushy snow mixed with ice, the cold whipping his face like a thin blade. "Mr. Nelson," the attendant was waiting, hands tucked into his thick coat pockets. "I remember him well," he said, squinting toward Road 77. "He got coffee, filled up the tank, said he was heading home." The kid was cheerful, no sign of fear. Keller jotted notes quickly, his voice low and steady. "Anyone else in the station at the time?" Mr. Nelson shook his head. "No heavy snow. After he left, I just watched his taillights disappear into the fog." Keller paced the parking lot, eyes scanning the faded tire tracks under fresh snow. At the roadside edge, he spotted a drag mark about 2 meters long, leading toward the pine woods. He crouched down, flashlight beam cutting through the snow, revealing a dark gray patch, mud mixed with gasoline. "A collision mark?" a young officer asked. Keller replied curtly, "Possibly." They marked the area with red tape, then continued along the path leading to Gull Lake. At the third bend, Keller found a few damp half-smoked Marlboro cigarette butts. He carefully picked them up, sealing them in an evidence bag, something no one in 1988 thought would hold value more than 3 decades later. Farther on, thick snow blanketed a small slope toward the lake. A cold wind carried a metallic rusty tang. Keller eyed the murky ice, seeing no cracks or sinkholes. He knew if a vehicle had gone into the lake, the ice wouldn't be this smooth. As evening fell, light fading, Keller returned to his car and radioed, "I need 2 units to expand the search north of the lake. Check the woods along County Road 115. When another patrol arrived, snow had started falling again. Headlight beams swept the road, glinting off each ice crystal. An officer reported, "No brake marks or debris, just a plain glove, no logo, could be from a fisherman." Keller pocketed it, saying nothing more. That evening, at the police station, the preliminary report was typed on an old IBM typewriter. "Possible accident," Keller wrote, not ruling out the victim leaving the vehicle for help. He paused, looking up at the wall map where red pins marked searched areas. The map looked like a patchy chessboard of white and red, white for snow, red for hope. Frank Myers walked in, coat dusted with snow, face sallow from sleeplessness. "Any news on my son?" Keller shook his head gently. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Myers, but if he slipped on the ice—" "No," Frank interrupted, his voice breaking. "Evan's a mechanic. He knows machines, knows the roads. He wouldn't be dumb enough to drive onto the lake in a snowstorm." He slammed his fist on the desk, rattling the stack of files. Keller looked at him, seeing fear and anger fused in the father's eyes. "I'll find him," he said quietly, "but you have to prepare for every possibility." As Frank left, Keller stood still. Outside the window, snow fell heavily, streetlights casting a pallid yellow glow. He picked up his coffee mug, took a sip, then looked down at the glove on the desk. A small, ordinary thing, but in a case like this, everything could be the final piece. That night, as Keller drove home, the car radio aired a brief bulletin. "The disappearance of 22-year-old Evan Myers is under investigation. Police urge Gull Lake area residents to report any suspicious signs." He turned off the radio, letting the wind's howl fill the silence outside. His headlights sliced through the snow, sweeping over wet, cold trees. On the white road, no tire tracks except his own. In that moment, Keller felt a vague wrongness, like a shadow slipping behind. But he shook it off, doused the thought, and drove straight into the darkness, swallowing the icy Minnesota road. The next morning, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the ground blanketed in white like a fresh sheet of fabric. The lead gray sky hung low over the pines around Gull Lake, so quiet that the crunch of tires on the ice could be heard clearly. Sergeant Keller returned to the scene with the rescue team, carrying a map of the area, a compass, and a handheld radio. He signaled for the team to split into 3 groups, one to sweep along the eastern shore, another to move through the thin strip of forest connecting County Roads 77 and 115, and the final group to check the paths leading down to the lake's surface. "No one goes alone," Keller instructed, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Keep constant contact, report in every 10 minutes. The wind blew hard, making the ice surface hum with faint sounds, like a suppressed sigh deep in the lake's heart. The search team used poles to probe the ice's thickness, flashlight beams sweeping across the frozen water. A young officer called out, "There's a crack here, Sarge." Keller stepped over, knelt down. It was just an old crack, covered by a half-inch layer of new ice. He touched it with his gloved hand, feeling the biting cold travel up his arm. "Not this one," he said, then stood up. By noon, the snow had melted into drifting fog, reducing visibility to just a few dozen meters. The smell of gasoline and oil from the patrol boat's engine mixed into the damp air. On the shore, Frank Myers stood silent, arms crossed over his chest, watching each group move. He said nothing, just stared at the endless expanse of the lake, as if it had swallowed everything. Marla, his wife, clutched the copper bracelet tightly in her coat pocket, her fingers numb with cold. "Do you think he's still alive?" she asked, her voice softer than the wind. Frank didn't answer. Around 2 in the afternoon, a team member spotted something strange, floating near the edge of the ice. A single black glove, soaked through. Keller took it, placed it in his palm, examined the stitching. No logo, no distinctive marks. He slipped it into a sealed nylon bag. "It could be Evans, but it might not be related at all," he said quietly, his voice weary. "We need something more specific." By dusk, the wind shifted, bringing cold air from the north sweeping down. The snow began to fall again, small flakes coming down so thickly that they erased every footprint, just pressed into the ice. Keller signaled for the teams to pull back. He stood alone by the lake shore, watching the yellow lights from the rescue vehicles reflect off the thickening ice. The sight was beautiful but eerie, as if the lake itself were hiding something beneath. As he turned to go, Frank Myers approached, his voice low but filled with pent-up anger. "You're not stopping, are you?" Keller looked at the man, his eyes understanding the pain, but also heavy with fatigue. "We'll keep going," he replied, "but with snow this thick, we can't find anything. We might have to wait until spring." Frank nodded, his lips pressed tight. He knew that meant hope was being buried under the ice, as thick as his son. Back at the office, Keller spread the map on the table, red pins marking the searched areas. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it, smoke mingling with the cold steam rising around the dim yellow desk lamp. The missing persons file number 88, ESIS 1143, lay open in the middle of the table, Evan's photo smiling in front of the garage clear as day. "Where are you, kid?" he muttered, his voice lost in the smoke. Outside the window, the wind howled long through the row of pines, carrying a faint clatter from the distant lake surface. In that moment, Keller suddenly shivered, not from the cold, but from a hunch that something was still lurking under the thick ice of Gull Lake, waiting for the day it would thaw. 3 weeks after the large-scale search around Gull Lake, Minnesota, sank back into its thick winter, the snow fell so heavily that the utility poles along County Road 77 were just blurred white lines in the haze. At the Crow Wing County Sheriff's Office, the search map was now covered in a thin layer of dust. The red pins, once marking swept areas, had become meaningless. Sergeant Keller sat at his desk, holding a cup of cold coffee, eyes fixed on the file coded 88-1143, victim's name, Evan Myers. The scene report, witness statements, and evidence list were sparse. Just a few lines about a glove, a pack of cigarettes, and drag marks in the snow that the storm had erased. He folded the file shut, sighed. "Nothing new," he muttered, his voice gravelly. Outside, snow blanketed the walkways. The salt-streaked patrol cars rumbled faintly in the wind. A young deputy entered, carrying an envelope with the scene analysis report. "No additional traces, Sarge. We combed the entire western edge of Gull Lake, the roadside woods too. No car, no debris." Keller nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "No skid marks, no swerves, and no one saw him with anyone else." He removed his glasses, rubbed his temples. He vanished into the snow like he never existed. That afternoon, the Myers couple came to see him. Frank led the way, his heavy coat soaked, his face gaunt after many sleepless nights. Marla clutched her son's copper bracelet tightly, her hands chapped from the cold. "Mr. Keller," she said, her voice trembling, "it's been 3 weeks, and you still haven't found anything. You told us to trust you, but we need answers." Keller stood, keeping his tone gentle. "I understand, but there's no evidence of criminal activity. Your son might have had an accident. When spring comes, when the ice melts, we'll resume the search." Frank slammed his fist on the table, spilling the coffee cup. "An accident? He's an adult, knows the roads, knows how to drive. If the car skidded, at least we'd find it." Keller fell silent. He didn't know what more to say. The only answer he had was the blank space on the map. A week later, the Brainerd Dispatch ran a small article on page 3. 22-year-old man, missing in snowstorm night. Police suspend search, due to poor weather conditions. That tiny italicized line was the official notice to the community that the hunt for Evan Myers had stopped. Folks gradually stopped mentioning the name, replacing it with stories about the harshest winter in 10 years. At the office, Keller signed the final report, before shifting the file to pending no leads. He read through each line again, then folded it and clipped it into a stack of others. As he turned off the light and left the room, he glanced back at Evan's photo on the bulletin board. The young man beaming in his mechanic's coveralls, eyes bright, like they reflected a summer sky. The image made him pause for a moment. Snow fell thick in the yard, covering the footprints he'd just left. In the pale streetlight, Keller pulled on his hat, tugged his collar higher, and stepped into the white night. All sounds faded, leaving only the wind whistling through the pines. The disappearance of Evan Myers officially ended there. No sirens, no witnesses, just Minnesota's thick ice continuing to swallow one more secret. April 1989, spring came late to Minnesota. The ice on Gull Lake had only just begun to thaw, revealing dark streaks of water spreading through the white expanse. Along the lakeside roads, melting snow turned to mud, the air carrying hints of dampness and rust. After a long winter, Brainerd folks eagerly returned to fishing, burning trash in their yards, preparing for the rare warm days. But on the morning of April 16, when 2 fishermen at Mill Lacs Lake, more than 30 miles from Gull Lake, headed out early to check their nets, they spotted something strange floating in the murky water, something large, bloated and dark snagged on tree roots near the shore. At first they thought it was a deer carcass drifted from upstream, until the sharp stench of a human body hit them. The report reached the Mill Lacs County Sheriff's Office quickly. When Keller got the call, he was silent for a few seconds before replying, "I'll be there." The road to the lake was soggy, a light rain falling, water streaking the windshield like silvery ribbons. When he arrived, he saw a few deputies setting up barricades. The male body had been pulled ashore, lying on a plastic tarp. The corpse was bloated, the face distorted, no longer identifiable by sight. On the left wrist remained a segment of metal bracelet, with rusted keys. A pair of Nike Air Windrunner sneakers, 1987 model, still clung to the feet. Keller bent down, his gaze slowly scanning each detail. "Take it to the St. Cloud morgue," he said. "Keep the clothes, belongings intact. I want everything checked thoroughly." When the preliminary results came in, the medical examiners determined the body was male, age approximately 20-25, dead for over 3 months. No gunshot or stab wounds, just a slight fracture at the back of the head, possibly from impact with a hard object or ice. No ID, wallet or watch. All fingerprints destroyed by decomposition. The morgue photographed the face, but even the black and white shots couldn't aid identification. The final report noted, insufficient information to determine cause of death. Body assigned temporary code John Doe, 1989, Mille Lacs County. Keller read the file in silence. He paused at the entry, 1987 model Nike sneakers. Evan Myers had worn this type too. He remembered clearly, because Frank had shown him a photo of the shoes during the initial search. But there was no direct evidence proving this was Evan. DNA at the time was only used in a few special cases in New York, no equipment or funding for small towns like Brainerd. Keller knew that without other traces, this body would just be a number among thousands of missing persons across America. A few days later, Frank Myers got a call from Mille Lacs County Police. He and his wife were asked to come for identification. When the tarp was pulled back, Marla nearly collapsed. Frank stared for a long time, then shook his head, his voice hoarse. "Can't be sure." Evan was a bit taller, and he had a small scar on his right hand. They left in silence, carrying an emptiness more painful than the truth. The following week, the local paper ran a brief story. Unnamed body found at Mille Lacs Lake, suspected link to last year's disappearance, but identity unconfirmed. The sheriff issued a statement that no evidence indicates foul play. The file was tentatively closed with the note possible weather-related or ice skating accident. That evening, Keller drove alone around the shore of Gull Lake. The lake's surface was pitch black, reflecting the smeared moonlight, like an oil slick. He stopped the car, opened the door, stood silent in the wind. In his mind, images of the wet shoes, the rusted keychain, and the father's dazed eyes replayed over and over. Keller said softly, as if to himself, "Maybe he came back, it's just no one recognized him." Then he returned to the car, slammed the door. The engine roared to life, swallowing those words into the damp cold night of Minnesota, where even spring couldn't melt the ice of a secret just buried even deeper. September 1989. The autumn air swept into Brainerd, shedding the old snow, but leaving in the hearts of the townsfolk an indescribable silence. In the Crow Wing County Sheriff's Office, a thick file, labeled 88-1143, lay on Sergeant Richard Keller's desk. The yellowed pages, edges curled from dampness, marked nearly a year of fruitless investigation. On the cover, the red words "pending investigation" were about to be replaced by a closed stamp. Keller sat motionless, a half-smoked cigarette in the ashtray, thin smoke lingering in the afternoon light. He flipped through the final report from the Mille Lacs Forensics Lab one last time. Identity unknown, no signs of foul play, possible death by accident. A dry line that ended all hypotheses. As he signed the conclusion, a soft knock sounded at the door. Frank and Marla Myers entered, looking much older than a few months prior. Marla clutched an old photo album tightly, her hands trembling. "I heard you found a body," she said, her voice thin as thread. "But it's not Evan, right?" Keller hesitated, looking at the two waiting in silence. "We couldn't confirm the identity. No signs of foul play. He might have had an accident on the road, or slipped into the lake. I'm very sorry." Frank stood still, his eyes darkening. "You've said that since winter, Keller, accident ice skating. You don't know a thing." He turned to leave, then turned back, voice low. "If it was your son who went missing, would you let people say accident without digging to the bottom of the truth?" Keller didn't answer. The door closed, leaving the room with only the ticking clock and the smell of burnt-out tobacco. The final report was sent to headquarters. The Evan Myers file, missing person case 88-1143, was officially marked inactive. A small article appeared in the Brainerd Dispatch. Sheriff's Office concludes no foul play in Evan Myers' disappearance. Victim likely perished in winter accident. Below was an old photo of Evan, bright smile, eyes straight into the lens, the only remaining photo used in all the search notices over the past year. Winter came again. Gull Lake froze over once more, old cracks covered by thicker new ice. Frank still drove to the lakeshore every weekend, standing alone in the vast white expanse, gazing down at the silent frozen surface. Marla stopped going along. She feared the cold, feared what might lie beneath. In their small house on the south side of Brainerd, the copper bracelet engraved with E still sat on the altar, next to the photo of Evan, in his jean jacket, hair tousled by the wind. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, flakes light as ash. On the other side of town, Keller left the force, hanging his uniform in the wooden closet. He submitted early retirement papers, citing health reasons. Colleagues congratulated him, all thinking he deserved rest after years of service. No one mentioned the Evan Myers case anymore. The town returned to its daily rhythm, peaceful to the point of eeriness. But in Keller's small house by the woods, on his desk remained a thin file, a personal copy he kept. Under the desk lamp, his handwriting was still there, trembling slightly at the last line. No evidence of foul play, insufficient data to continue investigation. He stared at it for a long time, then gently folded it shut. Outside, the wind blew across the lake again, carrying the faint groan of cracking ice. A case closed, at least on paper. But for Keller and for the father standing silently by Gull Lake each snowy season, it had only just begun to become a ghost. The 1990s passed in silence, and Brainerd seemed to forget the name Evan Myers that once shook the whole town. After that harsh winter, life returned to its old orbit. Schools reopened, snow festivals resumed. Tourists from Minneapolis flocked to the lake region for summer vacations. Along Washington Avenue, diners lit up early each morning, the smell of pancakes mingling with the steady hum of coffee machines every Sunday. People talked about the high school football team, gas prices, the walleye season, but no one mentioned the 1988 disappearance anymore. The photo of Evan, that once hung on the Lutheran Church bulletin board, was replaced by a flyer for an orphanage fundraiser. Time, with its cold indifference, gradually covered everything in a layer of forgetful dust. Sergeant Richard Keller officially retired in early 1992. He sold the small house near Gull River and opened an auto repair shop on Main Street, just a few blocks from downtown Brainerd. Keller's Auto Repair became a familiar spot for locals, the quiet man with oil-stained hands and weary eyes, always ready to help anyone stranded in the bitter winter cold. No one mentioned his police past anymore, except occasionally, some old-timers still called him Sarge, his old nickname from his days on the force. Keller just smiled, neither correcting nor explaining. On the south side of town, Frank and Marla Myers still lived in their old house, but their smiles were rarer than before. Marla no longer had the strength to go to the lakeshore each spring, while Frank still drove his old Ford Bronco along Gull Lake every weekend, stopping at the same spot, gazing down at the water, as if waiting for something to surface. In the truck he always carried the copper bracelet engraved with E, sometimes holding it in his hand for hours without a word. Neighbors called them the poor couple, then stopped asking. People knew there were sorrows no one could save, only time could soften a bit. In August 1995, Brainerd held the Summer by the Lake Festival, celebrating the town's 50th anniversary. Keller was invited as a guest of honor for his contributions during his police service. He stood on the temporary wooden stage, wearing a dark shirt, receiving a plaque from the mayor's hand. The crowd applauded, music rang out lively, but his eyes remained lost, directed toward the distant lake, where the sunset reflected in long red streaks. In that moment, Keller felt like he saw the young man's face again, the faint smile in the rippling water. He blinked, the image dissolved, leaving only the still lake. As the decade ended, Brainerd entered a new era. Downtown sprouted more shops, residential areas expanded north. The church was repainted. The Evan Myers case gradually became a vague story, sometimes retold in bars on winter nights, more like a local legend than a real memory. Those who had participated in the search had moved away or passed on. File 88 Evan 1143 lay dormant in the Crow Wing County archives, filed among hundreds of other unsolved disappearances. And Keller, every evening after closing the shop, still sat alone in the small office, the desk lamp casting a dim glow on the metal ashtray. He kept a copy of the case file in the bottom drawer, the paper yellowed, corners worn from folding. Occasionally he pulled it out to look, not knowing why, just to remind himself that something hadn't truly ended. Outside the window, the first winter of the new decade arrived, and Gull Lake froze over again, flat and calm, as if no one had ever been swallowed by its depths. 30 years had passed since Evan's disappearance, and the small Myers family home on the outskirts of Brainerd now held only Frank alone. The light green wooden house still stood there, but the front yard grass had grown wild, the wooden fence rotted, the Myers residence sign tilted to one side. Marla had passed away in the winter of 2016, at Essentia Health Duluth Hospital, after months battling lung disease. In the obituary, Frank wrote the final line in his own trembling handwriting. She passed in peace, carrying an expectation that would never be fulfilled. Our son Evan, if you're out there somewhere, know that your mother is still waiting. On the burial day, snow fell lightly. Old friends from town came to pay respects, but only a few still remembered that Marla once had a missing son. Most who knew the story had aged, some had left, and the young ones only heard about the case through vague tales from their parents. Frank stood silently by his wife's grave, clutching the copper bracelet engraved with E in his hand. He had carried it for 30 years, never letting it leave him. As the last shovelfuls of earth covered the casket, he bowed his head, whispering, "Now it's just me, Marla, but I'll keep searching." After the funeral, he returned to the empty house, cold kitchen, everything eerily quiet. The steady ticking of the wall clock was the only sound in the room. He still kept Evan's room as it was, the single bed, the faded Minnesota Twins poster, and the photo of the three of them from a summer in 1987. The last time the family smiled fully. In the evenings Frank often sat by the window, looking out toward Gull Lake in the distance. On clear nights, he could see the faint glow of the ice in the dark, still as a giant mirror. Sometimes he thought he heard the rumble of a truck engine from somewhere, faint like an echo from the past. He still maintained the habit of writing a letter to the Crow Wing County Sheriff's Office once a year, on exactly November 18th, the day Evan disappeared. Those letters all said the same thing: "I request reopening the file. Please re-examine Gull Lake." Something was overlooked. No one replied. Every year he still sent them, still waited, as if continuing would turn back time. In the spring of 2016, he received a letter from a new deputy, named Mike Harmon, who had stumbled upon the old file in the archives. In the letter, he wrote briefly, "We will keep this file in the cold case category. My condolences to you." Frank read it over and over many times, then folded the letter and stored it with the E-bracelet in a wooden box. He knew he didn't have many years left, but he still kept the habit of driving to the lake shore every afternoon, stopping at the exact spot from years ago, where he once stood with Keller when the first snow fell. He sat there for hours, gazing at the still water, waiting for some sign he couldn't name. In the sky, a flock of migrating geese flew over, leaving their hoarse calls echoing down. Frank looked up, smiling faintly. "Evan," he whispered, "your mother has searched enough. Now it's Dad's turn." He with the said their mother has searched enough. Now it's Dad's turn. 36 years after Evan Myers disappeared, Minnesota winter returned with skin-cutting cold and endless long nights. Snow blanketed the road leading to the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension (BCA) building in St. Paul, where cases forgotten for decades were being revived thanks to new technology. In the small third-floor room, Detective Nora Ellison, 33 years old, with her blonde hair tied back neatly, hunched over a desk buried in files. On her computer screen, the text "Cold Case 88, EC 1143, Evan Myers, missing 1988, stood out clearly. A small note in the bottom left corner read, "Status inactive since 1989. Nora rested her chin on her hand, rereading the old report, the lines typed on an IBM typewriter blurred. Insufficient evidence, no signs of foul play, possible death by accident. Everything was too clean, too neat for a case full of gaps. She opened the photo file in the database, a black and white photo of John Doe 1989, Mille Lacs County, an unidentified male body. The face swollen, old Nike shoes, a rusted keychain scrap. Below the photo was the note, no match with any missing persons records at the time. Nora leaned back in her chair, her eyes gazing out the window, where snow was falling in long, hazy sheets. In recent years, she and her team of BCA investigators had been tasked with reviewing hundreds of cold cases using forensic genealogy, technology that matches DNA with public genealogy databases. And when she saw this file, A strange feeling made her unable to let it go. She flipped to Sergeant Keller's 1989 report, the last line stating, "Insufficient data to continue investigation." But above it, one detail caught her attention: a drag mark, about 2 meters long near the forest edge, mixed with mud and gasoline. A drag mark, Nora muttered. Why would there be gasoline mixed in the mud, if it was just an accident? She highlighted that section with a red pen, then stood up and hurried to the evidence storage room. The storage was cold and smelled of damp paper mixed with metal. The custodian, Harold Mertz, was surprised to see her. "What are you looking for?" "The evidence from Case 88, EC 1143. I need to know if anything from the scene is still kept." He rummaged in the wooden cabinet, then pulled out a dusty plastic box labeled, "Evidence, UNCL End 1989. Inside was a black glove, several Marlboro cigarette butts, and a sealed report signed R. Keller. Nora looked at the yellowed evidence and shivered, as if the past still held its chill. She took photos, sent a request for trace DNA analysis to the BCA lab. A few days later, the results came back. The cells on the glove were too old, unable to extract a complete sequence. But the John Doe 1989 data was viable. She discovered bone samples, still stored in the forensic vault at St. Cloud Hospital, where the body had been processed. Nora sent an urgent memo requesting permission for reanalysis using next-generation sequencing technology, and shipped the sample to Paragon Gen Labs in California, one of the top private labs in genealogical DNA. 3 weeks later, she received an email with a simple subject line: "Potential familial match found." On the screen, the results showed a high match rate with genealogical data from a Myers family in Duluth. Nora held her breath. She cross-checked. Frank Myers, Evan's father, had died in 2019, but his DNA profile had been stored in the state health program. Everything matched perfectly. She sat still for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The nameless body in Mill Lacs, for 35 years, was Evan Myers. Nora shut down the computer, put on her coat, and stepped out onto the porch. Snow was still falling heavily, blanketing the parking lot white. She looked up at the murky sky, exhaling a thin plume of smoke, feeling something shift, like the old layers of ice from the past beginning to crack. Somewhere in the silence of Minnesota, a case thought long dead was being revived. On Monday morning, Nora Ellison returned to the BCA office as snow covered the walkways, gray light filtering through the window frames. On her desk, the email from Paragon Gen Labs was still open, with the cold but weighty confirmation: sample 89 Mill Lacs, positively identified as Evan Myers, Crow Wing County missing person, 1988. Probability, 99.998%. Below was the electronic signature of Dr. Elena Zhou, genealogical DNA analyst. Nora sat silently, staring at that number. 36 years. 36 years. A nameless body lay in the John Doe 1989 file, finally had a name. Evan Myers was no longer a missing person. She shivered at the thought of the father who had died just 3 years earlier, never hearing the news that his son had finally been found. She printed the results, placed them in a new file titled Case 88 Mill 1143, reclassified, Homicide Investigation. Before signing off, Nora paused, rereading Keller's old report. Everything seemed neatly arranged, almost too perfect. No signs of foul play, possible accidental death, but it was the gaps in that perfection that made her suspicious. The drag mark mixed with gasoline, the car never found, and the body floating more than 30 miles from the scene, all mismatched with the accident scenario. Nora took the red pen, wrote in the margin, "Need to review investigator background." That afternoon, she went to the Crow Wing County Police Personnel Records Room. In the old archives, she found Sergeant Richard Keller's personnel file, enlisted in 1973, joined the police force in 1979, retired in 1992, reason early retirement for health. The file showed no irregularities, but Nora noticed a small line below: last assignment, lead investigator, Case 88 Mill 1143. She exhaled, closed the file, feeling a cold draft on the back of her neck. As she returned to her car, she opened her notebook, jotted down a few lines: check connection Keller, Myers family. That night, she uploaded the resequenced DNA data to GED Match, a site where millions of Americans voluntarily shared genetic information to find relatives. Just hours later, results appeared on the screen. 2 partial matches with the case DNA sample. People with the surname Keller, living right in Brainerd. One of them was the nephew of Richard Keller. Nora stared at the data table. The genetic relationship indicators clear. Predicted relationship, first cousin once removed. She gripped the pen tightly, her heart racing. The threads were starting to connect, and every strand led to the same name. The next day, Nora reported to her superior, Captain Henry Ward. He listened, his eyebrows furrowing as she presented. "Are you sure?" he asked. "It could just be coincidence." Nora replied firmly, "No sir. Evan's DNA matches a Keller family branch, and it can't be random when the lead investigator has that name." Ward sighed, leaning back in his chair. If true, we're talking about a cop who was once the town's hero. Nora didn't respond. She just looked out the window, where snow was starting to fall again. That evening, she drove to Brainerd, passing the small road along Gull Lake, where the Keller house still stood, a gray-painted wooden home, roof covered in snow, thin smoke rising from the chimney. The windows cast a faint golden light. Nora sat in her car, noting Keller, Richard, 65 years old, retired 1992, currently lives at old address, owns Keller's auto repair shop. She sat still for a few more minutes, looking at that quiet house, where the man once seen as Brainerd's symbol of dedication, lived a peaceful life, unaware that the ghost of the past was about to knock. As Nora turned the car back toward the hotel, the snow fell thicker, street lights casting hazy beams on the ice of Gull Lake. She wondered if Keller knew that those layers of ice were about to crack, exposing the truth he had buried for 36 years. That night, Minnesota was strangely silent, only the wind and the heartbeat of a revived case in the darkness. For many nights in a row, Nora Ellison barely left her desk. In the pale blue glow of the screen, the DNA data strings stretched like a matrix, hundreds of genetic segments overlapping, linking into an invisible map of bloodlines. She opened the GenMatch visualizer software, entered the code for the DNA sample belonging to Evan Myers, and the related match results. Names appeared on the screen one by one. Keller Grant, 42 years old, Brainerd, Minnesota. Keller Denise, 38 years old, Crow Wing County. Then another branch, Keller Richard, 65 years old. In the notes column, the software automatically suggested, possible paternal relative, second degree. Nora gripped the pen tightly, feeling the air around her thicken. In the room, only the hum of the fan, and the solitary click of the keyboard echoed. Every path, every gene sequence, led to the same person. She built a manual family tree, spreading a large sheet of paper on the desk, using a red pen to connect the Keller branches. In the center, she circled the name Richard Keller, noting retired police sergeant, lead investigator 1988. To the left she wrote Evan Myers victim. A thin diagonal line connected the two names, the fragile thread between investigator and victim. The more she looked, the more chilled she felt. If the analysis was correct, Keller wasn't just the case handler, but had a distant blood relation to the victim himself. The next day, Nora brought the family tree to Captain Ward. He looked at the sprawling diagram on the desk, his eyebrows furrowed tightly. "You're saying Keller might share blood with the victim?" "Not directly," Nora replied. "Possibly distant relatives, same ancestors a few generations back, but what's notable is all the data points to the same area. Both the Keller and Myers families have lived around Brainerd for generations." Ward was silent for a long time, then said, "If this is true, Keller might have known Evan before." He looked at her, his voice lowering. "What do you plan to do next?" Nora said quietly, decisively, "I need confirmation. I need a DNA sample from Keller." That afternoon, she returned to the Brainerd Public Library, where old local newspapers were archived. In the 1988 Brainerd Dispatch, there was a black and white photo of the Evan Myers search team. Keller standing in the front row, gaze directed at the lake, next to Frank Myers, the victim's father. The two men had once stood shoulder to shoulder, in the effort to find a boy who was already dead. Nora froze. She folded the newspaper, feeling as if a layer of ice had just broken. That evening, she sat in her small motel room off Highway 371, snow still falling sporadically outside. On the desk, she spread notes, photos and files. Next to the cold coffee mug was the old file Keller had written. No signs of foul play, possible accident. In the corner, the scrawled signature R. Keller, in black ink. Nora murmured under her breath, almost a whisper, "You knew exactly what happened." She opened her notebook, added a line. Next step, obtain surreptitious sample, confirm genetic match. The next morning, Nora went to Keller's Auto Repair, a small shop along Main Street. The metal sign was old, paint peeling. Through the glass door, she saw Keller bent under the chassis of an old Ford, the golden light from the heater lamp casting on his grease-smeared face. He was older than in his file, slightly stooped, but still carried a rugged air. Nora stood outside the car, observing for a long while. When he stepped out, removing his gloves, holding a steaming coffee cup, she clearly saw his right arm tremble slightly from age. Inside the paper cup was the opportunity she needed. Keller set the cup down on the trash bin in front of the shop and turned back to the garage. Nora waited a few minutes, approached, picked up the cup, and carefully placed it in the prepared paper bag. On the rim were clear lipstick marks and a few epithelial cells, enough for DNA testing. She sealed the bag, labeled it Sample, Keller R. As she started the car leaving Brainerd, she glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing Keller's wooden house recede, thin smoke from the chimney blending into the gray sky. Part of her trembled with fear, part calm, as if she stood on the fragile boundary between justice and crime. Behind her, snow began to fall again, white flakes landing on the tire tracks, covering every trace, but this time, the past would not be buried so easily. The afternoon of the next day, Nora Ellison returned to St. Paul in silence, the government vehicle gliding over the misty road. In the seat pocket beside her was a sealed envelope containing the paper coffee cup, a small but weighty piece of evidence. Upon arriving at BCA headquarters, she submitted the sample to the biological forensics lab. Technician Ryan Cho, who had worked with her on many cases, took it, his eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Whose is this?" Nora replied softly. "Someone from the past." He nodded, asking no more. The covert DNA analysis process had to be kept absolutely secret. Only once the results confirmed could they apply for a legal collection warrant. Nora signed the log, looking at her signature in blue ink on the paper, feeling as if she had marked an irreversible path. 3 days of waiting dragged by slowly. Outside, snow fell thickly, blanketing the BCA building like a white shroud. Nora arrived at the office early, brewing strong black coffee, trying to keep her mind sharp. She reopened the old file, tracing the vague statements in the 1988 report. No witnesses, no vehicle debris, no vehicle found. All recorded by Keller. Each line now read like the excuses of someone who knew too much. That afternoon, when the internal phone rang, Nora's heart clenched. Ryan's voice came over the line. "Nora, you should come down here and see the results." The lab room was cold and brightly lit. On the screen, 2 DNA strands appeared side by side, one from Evan's bone sample, one from Keller's coffee cup. The genetic markers matched almost perfectly. Red text flashing. Match confirmed. 99.999% probability. Ryan looked at her, his voice low. "It can't be a coincidence. Same person." Nora stood silent, her eyes fixed on the screen. She didn't know what the feeling in her chest was, victory, fear, or rage. Part of her didn't want to believe that the man once called Brainerd's hero was the perpetrator, but evidence didn't know how to lie. Late that afternoon, she brought the results to Captain Ward. He read a few lines, looked up, his eyes a mix of shock and sadness. "We'll have to handle this very carefully," he said. "If it leaks out, the press will tear this case to shreds." Nora nodded. They needed more legal evidence before applying for an arrest warrant, specifically, a legally collected DNA sample. "I'll go back to Brainerd," she said. "I'll handle this personally." Ward sighed. "Be careful, that man's a former cop. He knows how to cover his tracks." 3 days later, Nora returned to Brainerd with 2 surveillance unit colleagues. They sat in a gray SUV, parked a block from Keller's Auto Repair, the telephoto lens aimed at the front door. Every movement of Keller's was recorded. He opened at 7 a.m., drank coffee at Paul's Diner at 9 a.m., chatted with the parts store owner nearby, then returned to the shop. An ordinary morning, repeated for years. But this time there was one small difference. When Keller left the diner, he left his ceramic coffee mug on the table. An undercover officer quickly entered, picked up the mug and placed it in a sealed bag. The sample was sent back to St. Paul the same day. When Nora received the results on Monday morning, she already knew the answer, but still felt a chill upon seeing the second confirmation. Match confirmed. Same individual as sample collected from 1988 crime scene. There was no doubt anymore. Richard Keller's DNA matched completely with the trace sample taken from Evan's jacket, the evidence that his father had kept and handed over to police in 1989. The final piece had clicked into place. That evening Nora drove back to the hotel in silence. On the radio, the weather report announced an incoming storm, sweeping through north-central Minnesota. She looked out the windshield, snowflakes sparkling under the streetlights. Somewhere, in the old log cabin on the edge of Gull Lake, Keller was probably sitting by the fireplace, believing the past had finally settled, but Nora knew that in just a few days, that ice would shatter. As she pulled up to the hotel and stepped out, the crunch of snow underfoot sounded like the snap of a secret exposed after 36 years of silence. The Brainerd sky was leaden gray, snow falling relentlessly through the night, blanketing the roads like a thick, fine quilt. At 5 a.m., on March 5, 2024, the street by Gull River Bridge was so quiet that only the rumble of a passing semi-truck could be heard. In the pale gray-painted log house, Richard Keller was still asleep. He dozed in the old armchair in the living room, the fireplace glowing red, the crackle of burning wood mingling with the howl of wind at the door. On the table, a small radio murmured the early news program, the female announcer's voice low and somber. This morning, temperatures statewide will drop below -12 degrees. Roads around Gull Lake are temporarily closed for snow removal. As her words ended, outside the window, red and blue lights flashed, piercing the misty haze. A speaker blared crisp and firm. Crow Wing County Sheriff's Office. Mr. Keller, exit the house immediately. Outside snow flew up as 4 police cars surrounded the yard. Nora Ellison stepped out of the lead vehicle, her black coat pulled high at the collar, holstered pistol at her hip, arrest warrant in hand inside a sealed envelope. Beside her was Captain Ward along with 2 local officers. Everything unfolded in silence, broken only by the falling snow and the static crackle of radios. The front door creaked open. Keller appeared in an old sweater, hair disheveled, eyes squinting against the harsh light. He looked around bewildered and cold at once. "What's going on?" "I haven't done anything," he said, his voice hoarse from interrupted sleep. Ward stepped forward, his tone firm. "Richard Keller, by order of the Crow Wing County Court, you are under arrest on suspicion of involvement in the murder of Evan Myers, which occurred in 1988. In that moment, time seemed to stop. Keller took a small step back, his eyes widening, his face rigid. "Murder? That was an accident." He trembled, his hands rising instinctively. 2 officers moved in, turning him around, cuffing his wrists with cold metal. The clink of metal echoed clearly in the still air, carrying across the frozen lake. Nora stood back, watching the scene through the white vapor of her breath. For a moment, she didn't see a perpetrator, but an old man who had carried the burden of his past too long. But justice didn't distinguish by age. A neighbor cracked their curtains, then another, and another. Phone lights flashed, recording the image of Keller being led across the yard, his feet sinking into the snow. They whispered, murmurs cutting through the wind. "It can't be. That's Mr. Keller. He helped search for that boy." An elderly woman stood on her porch, tears streaming down cheeks flushed red from the cold. She murmured, "Lord, he taught my son how to ice fish." Keller was led to the black SUV parked at the door. Nora opened the rear door, leaning in slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Keller, everything you say will be recorded. You have the right to remain silent." He didn't look at her, only murmuring, "I tried to forget it." 36 years. As the door closed, Nora caught a glimpse in his eyes of fear mixed with faint relief, as if finally he no longer had to carry that secret alone. The vehicle started up, its engine rumbling against the white snow, tires leaving 2 long tracks leading to the main road. Behind the small log homes of Gull River, still lay shrouded in cold mist, but lights began flickering on in windows. News of the arrest spread like wildfire. By 8 a.m., local news channels were broadcasting in unison. Breaking news: former police officer Richard Keller arrested in connection with 1988 cold case. The arrest shocks Brainerd community. Nora sat in the car, looking in the rearview mirror, at Keller's huddled form between the 2 officers. Outside, the weak sun emerged, casting pale light on the ice covering Gull Lake. She knew that from this moment on, Brainerd would never be the same. A town once proud of its peace now had to face a cold truth, that sometimes, the demon they feared most lived right among them, in the guise of the person they had trusted the most. The Crow Wing County Sheriff's Office interrogation room was cold and barren, walls painted pale gray, fluorescent lights casting a dull reflection on the metal table. Richard Keller sat there, the marks of the cuffs still red on his wrists, an untouched glass of water in front of him. He stared at a small crack in the tabletop, his shoulders trembling slightly. On the wall, the clock ticked steadily, its hands moving with maddening slowness. The door swung open, and Nora Ellison entered, carrying a thick file tucked under her arm. Captain Ward followed, standing still for a moment before nodding slightly and closing the door, leaving her alone with him. "Good morning, Mr. Keller," Nora said evenly. "I'm Special Agent Nora Ellison, Cold Case Unit with the BCA. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the 1988 case." Keller looked up, his eyes cloudy like old ice. "That one?" He gave a dry laugh. "Wasn't it ruled an accident? I wrote the report myself." Nora pulled out a chair and sat across from him, flipping open the file. "Yes, and you were the last person to see Evan Myers alive." He frowned, leaning back in his chair, hands clasped together. "I helped search for that kid for weeks. I had no reason to hurt the boy." Nora didn't respond, only opening a small evidence bag and pulling out a sealed envelope containing a printout from the DNA analysis results. "These are the results from the BCA lab and Paragon Gen Labs. The DNA found on Evan's jacket matches your DNA from personal items exactly, both samples with a 99.999% match probability." Keller stared at the photo for a long moment, then looked up, his voice hoarse. "Impossible. I never touched that kid's jacket." Nora leaned forward slightly, her tone steady. "Maybe you don't remember, but DNA doesn't lie. The second sample was legally collected from the coffee mug you left at Paul's Diner." A long silence stretched. Only Keller's heavy breathing could be heard. He put a hand to his forehead, lips pressed tight. "What do you want me to say? That I killed him? Ridiculous. I was a cop. I saved lives." "Yes," Nora replied softly, "and you were once seen as a hero by the people here. But maybe that's what made you think you could hide the truth." Keller stared at her hard, a flash of anger in his eyes. "You don't know anything, you just see numbers on paper. You weren't there that snowy night. He disappeared, and I've been haunted by it my whole life." Nora opened the old crime scene photo and slid it toward him, the image of frozen Gull Lake, the mud and gasoline drag mark circled. "I know, Mr. Keller, this drag mark wasn't an accident. Someone searching wouldn't need to clean up their own tracks." Keller bowed his head, silent. 1 minute, 2 minutes passed, only the clock ticking. Then he chuckled softly, but the laugh sounded raspy and weary. 36 years, girl. If I'd really done something wrong, you think I could have survived all those years? I've punished myself enough." Nora tilted her head slightly, her gaze fixed on his face. "Maybe, but justice doesn't go by time, Mr. Keller." She started the recording, her voice even. "I need you to confirm that on the night of November 18, 1988, you were present in the area of County Road 77. He closed his eyes, sighing. "I was home. I had an early shift the next morning." "No," Nora interrupted, sliding over a photocopy of the duty roster she'd found in the archives. "You were recorded as off-duty that night. A witness at the gas station said they saw your patrol car parked near the woods, right around the time Evan disappeared." Keller opened his eyes, his voice faltering. "That witness misremembered." Nora didn't argue, only saying softly, "Maybe, but now I have reason to believe that night you encountered Evan." She stood, gathering her documents. "You have the right to remain silent, but remember, silence leaves its own traces." Before leaving the room, she paused at the door, turning back to look at him, the silver-haired man sitting alone in the stark white room. "I think you've lived with that ghost long enough, and sometimes the truth is the only way to find peace." The door closed behind her, the lock clicking, leaving Keller alone, his hands clenched around the cold glass of water, his gaze drifting to some distant place, where the ice on Gull Lake still held what he hadn't dared admit. The second interrogation took place 2 days later, in the same gray-painted room. Outside, snow was falling again, the wind whistling through the door cracks like a prolonged whisper. Nora entered, carrying only a cup of coffee and an old photograph. Keller was already seated, a thin jacket draped loosely over his shoulders, his face more gaunt than before. He said nothing as she sat down. No lawyer beside him now, just two people and the unnamed years between them. Keller, Nora began, her voice slow and soft. I'm not here to make you lie or to pin blame. I just want to know what really happened on the night of November 18, 1988. He looked up at her, his cloudy gray eyes seeming to crack. You don't understand. No one does. Nora set down her coffee cup, sliding the photograph toward him. It was a shot of Gull Lake's surface that winter, patrol car lights reflecting faintly on the ice. I think maybe now, after 36 years, you want to be understood. Keller stared at the photo for a long time. His breathing grew heavier, his shoulders trembling. I remember that night, he said quietly. It was so cold my hands went numb on the steering wheel. I'd had a few beers at the lodge before heading home. As I drove past that stretch of woods, I saw his truck, a gray Silverado, pulled off crooked on the shoulder, lights still on. I thought it had stalled, so I stopped. Evan was there, standing by the hood, flashlight in hand. The kid was relieved to see me, knowing I was a cop. He said he smelled gas, worried about an engine leak. I told him I'd check it. When I popped the hood, gas splashed on my hands. Then I don't know what happened. We argued. Nora leaned forward, her voice dropping. Why? Keller closed his eyes, his voice choking. Because I was drunk, and he said I shouldn't be driving like that. He said he'd report it to the superiors. He laughed bitterly. A 22-year-old kid threatening to report a veteran officer. I lost it. I grabbed him, just meant to shove him away so I could leave. But the kid lost his balance, slipped on the snow, head cracking against an ice ledge by the lake's edge. That sound, he paused, his clenched hands shaking. That sound's been in my head for 36 years. Nora said nothing, just let him continue. I ran back. Evan wasn't moving. I shook him, called his name over and over. No pulse. I panicked. The wind was howling, snow starting to fall. I looked around, no one. If I called it in, my career was over. I thought, I just needed to cover it up, at least until I figured something out. He bowed his head, his voice drifting like a confession. I dragged the body to the shore, used an anchor rope from my truck to tie around him, then pulled him out to the deepest part of the lake. I remember it clear as day. The ice was thick, but in the middle there was a thinner spot. I smashed it with a shovel, dropped him in, and the ice sealed right back up. Took just a few minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. The air in the room thickened, nothing but the clock's ticking and his ragged breaths. Nora asked softly, "What then?" Keller looked down at his aged hands, his eyes misty. I went back to the scene the next morning, staged the drag marks, hid the anchor rope. I reported no signs of foul play. Everyone believed it, even praised me for being thorough. He let out a dry laugh, then cradled his head. Every winter I hear the ice cracking, think it's Evan. I thought, if I stayed quiet long enough, the cold would bury it all. But it never faded. Nora turned on the recorder, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Keller, do you confirm that you caused the death of Evan Myers and concealed his body under the ice of Gull Lake?" He nodded slowly, tears rolling down his cheeks, mingling in the rigid wrinkles. "Yes, I didn't mean to kill him, but it was my hands that pushed him down." Nora turned off the recorder, closed her notebook, and stood. "Thank you for saying it. Evan deserved to be found, and you deserve to face it." As she left the room, Keller sat motionless, staring at the empty space before him. Outside the window, the last snowflakes of winter were falling, melting into the ice of Gull Lake, where, deep within it, the truth had slumbered too long. 3 days after the confession, the investigative team returned to Gull Lake, the first time in over 3 decades. The sky was a hazy gray, the lake's surface like an endless sheet of cold glass. Rescue unit trucks lined the shore, their flashing lights reflecting off the wet ice. Nora Ellison stood amid the wind, her thick coat cinched tight, a map in hand marked with the location Keller had indicated in his statement. Right in the middle of the lake, about 150 meters from shore, where the water's 15 meters deep, Keller had said, "That's where I dropped him." Now, the modern sonar team had deployed equipment across the area. The screen showed moving blips on a black background, the steady hum of the machine echoing in the silent expanse. Nora watched the radar screen's wavy lines. "Here," the technician pointed. "There's a metallic object about a meter long, near the lakebed structure. Next to it an organic mass, decomposed." The team fell silent for a few seconds. Nora nodded faintly. "Mark the coordinates. Prep the dive team. March in Minnesota." The water still so cold a few minutes immersion could cause paralysis, but the divers were ready, suited up in specialized gear, oxygen tanks strapped to their backs. As they jumped in, the water rippled, then quickly smoothed over, flat as if untouched. An hour passed. The wind picked up, whipping snow into flurries that blanketed the equipment crates. Nora paced the shore, her eyes fixed on the lake. Suddenly the radio crackled. "Team 1 here. We've got the object." Old anchor rope wrapped around bones. "Looks like boat mooring line." The group went quiet. Another voice cut in, trembling slightly. "There's fabric material and metal bits too. Seems like a keychain." Nora gripped the radio tight, her heart pounding. "Careful with recovery. Preserve the evidence." When the water broke open again, the 3 divers surfaced, towing a large black bag. They set it on the ice, snow clinging to its edges. Nora approached, knelt down, and nodded. The technician unzipped it, cold air escaping along with the scent of damp mud and time. Inside, what remained of a person, small skeletal frame, faded jeans, Nike sneakers nearly disintegrated. One of the divers pulled from the old belt pouch a small item, a copper ring engraved with an E tarnished, but the etching still clear. No one spoke. Nora breathed deep, lightly touching the evidence, her hand trembling faintly. "Evan Myers," she whispered. "Welcome home." The remains were transported to the St. Cloud Forensic Center, where forensic experts conducted the final examination. DNA confirmed a perfect match with the archived profile. The autopsy report affirmed the cause of death as skull trauma from blunt force impact. No doubt left. Keller's confession was truth. As Nora signed off on completing the process, she paused at the case status box. "Closed, solved." Beneath those words, she added a small note. "Body recovered March 2024. The next afternoon, a small ceremony was held on the shore of Gull Lake. A wooden table draped in white cloth. Atop it a photo of Evan from 1987. Youthful smile, eyes bright with life. A bouquet of snow-white flowers placed beside it. On the benches, a few Brainerd locals attended, including some who joined the original search years ago. No one spoke much. They just stood silent, heads bowed into the wind. As the forensics team placed Evan's ashes in a small wooden box on the table, Nora stood nearby, eyes on the lake, reflecting the silvery gray sky. The last snowflakes of the season drifted down, melting into droplets. Elsewhere, in a holding cell at Crow Wing County, Keller sat leaning against the wall, hands clasped together. He looked at no one, just closed his eyes, listening to the wind howling through the iron-barred window. Beneath the ice, what he'd once tried to hide had been brought to light, and perhaps for the first time in 36 years, Richard Keller truly felt the cold of a Minnesota winter, not out there anymore, but seeping right into him, where his conscience had long been frozen solid. 2 days after Evan Myers' remains were found, the Crow Wing County Administrative Building was packed with reporters and locals. They crowded under the melting snow-mud ground, mics and cameras aimed at the podium in the lobby. A banner behind read, in large letters, "Press Conference, Crow Wing County Sheriff's Office." The atmosphere was hushed, only the click of camera shutters and white breaths in the chilly air. At exactly 9 a.m., Sheriff Mark Dalton stepped out, face stern. Beside him was Detective Nora Ellison, standing still, eyes calm and steady. Before them, a stack of files, Evan Myers' old photo placed on the podium. Dalton adjusted the mic, his voice low but clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, after 36 years, the disappearance of Evan Myers in November 1988 has been officially closed. Thanks to modern DNA technology and the tireless efforts of the Cold Case Unit, we've confirmed the body found at Mill Lacs Lake in 1989 was Evan's. And more importantly, we have a confession." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Dalton paused a beat, then continued. "The person responsible for Evan Myers' death is former Sergeant Richard Keller, who was in charge of investigating the case." The noise erupted. Some in the back rows gasped in disbelief. A reporter raised a hand. "Sheriff, can you confirm Keller tampered with evidence during the 1988 investigation?" Dalton nodded slightly. Yes. He admitted in his statement that after a scuffle led to Evan Myers' death, he deliberately hid the body under the ice of Gull Lake and falsified his report to avoid discipline. The DNA evidence and confession have both been verified. The air grew thick. Pens scratched furiously. Flashes popped non-stop. Nora stood motionless, hands clasped in front. When a Care 11 reporter asked about her feelings after closing the case, Nora replied evenly, "DNA technology helped us do what previous generations couldn't, but above all, this is a victory for the truth." not for any one person. Every cold case solved is a person given back their name, a family given back answers. The words silenced the room. In that moment, no one saw just a young female investigator at the podium, but a symbol for those who pursue justice, even when time has buried everything. As the press conference ended, the first news reports aired on local TV. Images of Keller being led away in the snowy night intercut with footage of recovering Evan's body, overlaid with the anchor's lead, "Justice doesn't expire." Brainerd residents were stunned, sharing the story on social media, mixed with regret and outrage. One commenter wrote, "I used to get my car fixed at Keller's shop. He was real nice. Hard to believe." Another posted, "Evan's finally home." The whole town seemed to come alive with memories thought long buried. That afternoon, Nora returned to her office, gazing out the window where snow was melting into water, trickling down the glass. On her desk, Evan's youthful photo remained. Next to the closed case file, she murmured, as if to herself, "Justice doesn't expire." Outside, Gull Lake reflected the pale sunset, the wind carrying the first hints of spring warmth. But beneath that quiet water, 36 years of memory still rippled silently, like a reminder that no matter how long time stretches, the truth always finds its way back. The trial of Richard Keller was scheduled for early September 2024 at the Crow Wing County District Court, the red brick building in the heart of Brainerd, a place that was once peaceful now packed with people. From early morning, local television crews set up cameras outside, with the ticker running across the bottom of the screen. The 1988 Gull Lake cold case trial begins today. Hundreds of residents lined up in the chilly weather, many carrying photos of Evan Myers, others just standing silently, their eyes a mix of curiosity and bitterness. In the courtroom, the public seating was full. In the front row, Detective Nora Ellison sat next to the prosecution team, her face calm, but her eyes still carrying the weight of the investigation months. On the other side, Keller was led in, wearing a light blue shirt, with white hair, a wrinkled and gaunt face. When his eyes briefly met Nora's, he slightly bowed his head, a brief but heavy gesture like an admission. Prosecutor Megan Hartley opened with a clear voice, each word echoing in the room, "Your Honor, this is a case that has slept for more than 36 years, until science gave us the tools to hear the voice of the past. Evan Myers' body was found, and the defendant's DNA, Richard Keller's, has irrefutably confirmed that he is the one responsible for that death." Hartley presented the evidence, genetic test results, a recorded confession, sonar maps from the body recovery, along with a series of crime scene photos. Each image projected on the screen plunged the room into silence. The final one was a pair of faded Nike shoes and a copper bracelet engraved with the letter E. In the gallery, a few people choked up, scattered sobs echoing. When it was the defense attorney's turn, Alan Pierce, a graying man, stepped to the podium, his voice soft but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we do not deny the tragedy, but this is not premeditated murder. Richard Keller made a mistake in a drunken haze, in fear and human weakness. He is not a monster. He is a police officer who protected this community for more than 10 years. Pierce asked the court to reduce the charge from murder to manslaughter, unintentional killing, arguing that the incident was an accident covered up in panic, rather than an act of deliberate murder. The testimony phase stretched over 3 days. Nora was called to the stand. Under the lights, she recounted the investigation process, how DNA technology and genetic genealogy led them to Keller. When the prosecutor asked, "Do you believe Keller intentionally killed Evan Myers?" Nora was silent for a few seconds, then answered in a calm voice, "I believe he didn't intend to kill him, but he did intend to bury the truth, and to me, that's a sin no less than murder." Those words echoed through the room, causing many to bow their heads. On the fourth day, the prosecutor played the recorded confession. Keller's hoarse voice filled the air. "I just wanted to push him away, but the snow was slippery, and when he fell, I knew it was all over." When the tape ended, Keller sat with his head bowed, his hands clenched white-knuckled. In the public gallery, a middle-aged woman burst into tears. It was Anna Fisher, Evan's cousin, the only surviving family member. She stood up, looking straight at Keller. "We used to thank you, my mother used to trust you. For 36 years, you've lived peacefully, while my family lived with unanswered questions. Now I just want to know, that night, did you think of his parents?" Keller didn't answer. He only murmured, almost a whisper, "Every night." On the fifth day, the closing arguments ended. Prosecutor Hartley stood, looking toward the jury. "Justice is not for revenge, but to remind us that truth has value, even if it takes 36 years. Don't let time turn guilt into forgiveness. The words silenced the entire courtroom. Defense attorney Pierce quietly replied, "One can kill someone with fear, but one can also atone with honesty. Please look at him, not the man who hid the crime, but a human being who has been punished by his own memories." When Judge Teresa Slade announced the end of the closing arguments, the afternoon light streamed through the glass windows, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. Keller looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but serene. Behind him, Nora watched him, not with resentment, just a quiet sorrow. The case had run its course. Now there was only the sentence of justice, and the sentence of conscience, which would follow him to the end of his days. On the morning of September 18, 2024, the Crow Wing County Courthouse opened its doors for the sentencing. Outside, the sky was clear after a night rain, steam rising lightly from the damp pavement, while in the hallway, footsteps echoed evenly on the cold stone floor. The public benches were packed, not a seat empty. Many Brainerd residents had arrived early, some carrying photos of Evan Myers, others just silent, as if to witness the end of a tragedy that had haunted the whole town. In the front row, Nora Ellison sat next to prosecutor Megan Hartley, her eyes calm, but unable to hide her fatigue. When the courtroom doors opened, Richard Keller was led in. He wore a white shirt and gray vest, his wrists still cuffed in thin metal. His silver hair fell over his forehead, his face gaunt, but his eyes unusually serene. For a few seconds, he scanned the room, his gaze landing on Evan's photo on the prosecution table. Judge Teresa Slade stepped to the bench, her voice clear in the hushed space. "We will hear the jury's verdict." A clerk stood, opened the sealed paper, and read slowly. On the charge of second-degree murder, the jury finds the defendant Richard Keller not guilty. On the charges of manslaughter and obstruction of justice, the jury finds guilty. A wave of murmurs rose, whispers mixed with sighs. Keller closed his eyes, his face relaxing, as if he had prepared for this long ago. Nora glanced over, not surprised. She understood that with these charges, he would pay, but justice sometimes doesn't come through a harsh sentence, but through the final truth spoken. Judge Slade continued, "After considering all the evidence and testimony, the court sentences Richard Keller to 15 years in prison at the Minnesota State Penitentiary. He will be stripped of all retirement benefits and police titles. Time served begins immediately." She paused, her eyes on Keller, her voice slowing. "Mr. Keller, you were once praised as a guardian of justice, but 36 years ago, you buried it under the ice of Gull Lake. Today that justice no longer belongs to you, but to the young man whose chance at life you took away." The courtroom fell silent. Only the wind outside the windows rustled through the pines, carrying the scent of cold rain. Keller stood, his hands trembling, looked at the judge, then turned to the public gallery. In the crowd, Anna Fisher, Evan's cousin, was crying. Nora stood too, silently watching him. "I'd like to say a few words," Keller spoke, his voice hoarse, but resolute. "I've lived 36 years with guilt. I don't expect forgiveness, I just hope Evan, wherever he is, understands I didn't mean it. Every winter, I hear the ice cracking, and think he's calling me. Today I'm ready to hear it one last time." He paused, then bowed his head. After the hearing ended, police led Keller outside. The midday sun hit the steps, glinting off his handcuffs like a cold silver streak. Residents stood on both sides of the road, saying nothing, just watching. A few bowed their heads, a few turned away, but all shared the same feeling, pity mixed with bewilderment. At the end of the hall, Nora paused, watching Keller's figure shrink in the prisoner transport van. Ward stepped up, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've done it," he said. Nora nodded slightly. "Not just me. Evan wouldn't let us forget." That afternoon, Gull Lake was quiet again. On the KARE 11 Evening News, footage of the judge reading the sentence intercut with black and white clips from 1988, a patrol car driving through the snow. The anchor's voice intoned steadily. Former police officer Richard Keller, 65, sentenced to 15 years in prison in the unintentional killing of Evan Myers, closing a mystery that spanned over 3 decades. The final shot of the broadcast was Gull Lake at sunset, the sun's rays on the water just breaking from ice. There, the wind carried the first warmth of fall, and though it all seemed ended, something still wasn't quite at rest, a silence between winter and spring, where a young man's memory lingered, along with the justice just found. In the spring of 2025, the ice on Gull Lake began to melt, patches of water reflecting the clear blue sky. Brainerd warmed after a long winter, but the memory of the Evan Myers case still hung in the air. 6 months since the sentencing of Richard Keller, the town gradually returned to its daily rhythm, cars passing on Main Street, Paul's Diner busy again. Yet the story of the cop killer was still whispered over morning coffee. Hard to believe, a mechanic said. He used to help everyone. An older woman replied softly, both are pitiful, one lost his life, one lost his soul. The conversation stopped there. No one said more, just the steam from coffee, and the drip of melting snow outside the window. In St. Paul, Detective Nora Ellison sat at her desk in the cold case unit office. File 88, 1143, Evan Myers, was archived in the national database, marked closed, solved. She looked at the list of other unsolved cases, the familiar feeling washing over her, each name a void without answers. Evan's case was the first Nora had pursued to the end, the one that taught her justice isn't just catching the guilty, but restoring a name to the forgotten. She still clearly remembered the moment Keller confessed, when he whispered, "I just wanted peace." It wasn't full atonement, but it was the end to 36 years of silence. One afternoon, Nora received a letter from Anna Fisher, Evan's cousin. Inside was a photo from a memorial by Gull Lake, a small group standing around a wooden plaque engraved in memory of Evan Myers, lost to the cold, found by truth. Below were his birth and death years. Anna wrote, "I can't hate Keller forever. He did wrong, but it was also him who helped find Evan. Now we can rest." Nora read it, folded it, and put the letter in her desk drawer. She didn't cry, just sat still looking at the slanting afternoon light through the window, feeling relief like a storm had just passed. At Stillwater Prison, Keller lived quietly. He often went to the yard each morning, sitting watching the sun streaks on the wet ground. In his hand was a small notebook, the first page written, "Every winter is a sentence, every spring a reminder that nothing stays buried forever." The guard said he spoke little, but was always polite. Once when asked if he regretted it, Keller only replied, "If I could go back, I'd still stop the car that night, but I'd take him home." The guard fell silent, asked no more. For Keller, 15 years in prison wasn't the real punishment. The lifelong sentence he carried was the memory under the Gull Lake ice. Early May, Brainerd residents held a small memorial by the lake. No media, no officials, just a few dozen people bringing white flowers. Nora came too, standing silently in the back, listening to the water lap the shore. Anna approached, her smile tired but peaceful. "Now we know where to say goodbye," she said. Nora nodded. "No one really disappears," she replied softly. "We just haven't found them yet." They stood still watching the petals drift far out, merging into the sun-dappled water. When the ceremony ended, Nora stayed alone. She took from her pocket the copper bracelet engraved with E. The evidence returned to her, and gently released it to the water's edge. The sunlight glinted, the circle shining for a moment before sinking slowly. She watched until it vanished into the clear water. The wind blew lightly, carrying the scent of fresh mud and gentle ripples. Nora closed her eyes, breathing in the last chill of the season. She thought of Evan, of Keller, of the father who had stood through winter by the lake shore. All were silent now, but silence no longer meant loss, it meant peace. As Nora turned to leave, the sun was high, casting golden light on the melting lake. Water droplets trickled from the bank through the new green grass. The case's final winter had passed. In Minnesota, spring had truly arrived, not just to the land and sky, but to the souls once forgotten by time. Evan Myers, after 36 years, had finally come home. The story of the Minnesota 1988 cold case is not only a journey to seek justice for a forgotten young man, but also a clear reflection of the core values that modern American society still upholds: truth, personal responsibility, and faith in justice, no matter how long it takes. The 36 years of silence in the Evan Myers case symbolize how the past is sometimes buried under the thick ice of fear and guilt, like the surface of Gull Lake, where everything seems to have fallen asleep. But then, thanks to DNA technology, the perseverance of Detective Nora Ellison, and the unyielding spirit of those who believe that justice doesn't expire, the truth is finally brought to light. In a country like the United States, where faith in the legal system and personal ethics form the foundation, this story reminds us that time cannot erase responsibility. No matter who you are, a police officer, an ordinary citizen, or just a witness, daring to confront mistakes, even if late, is always the only way to regain peace. Like Keller, many people in real life may choose silence, hoping that time will blur their sins, but the truth, like Minnesota's spring, always returns, melting the ice, illuminating everything. That lesson is important in today's life, in a rapidly changing society, where information can be distorted and faith easily shaken. Honesty and perseverance in seeking the truth remain the foundation that makes America not only stronger, but also more humane, because justice is never too late if people still have the courage to seek it. Thank you for joining us on the journey to seek justice for Evan Myers, a testament that the truth, no matter how long it has been buried, will eventually be revealed. Please subscribe to the channel to continue following other cold case stories, where justice and faith are always awakened, even under the coldest ice.